us this morning, so it's gonna don't. It's not gonna be that good. So, but I do have some slides. So, all right. What we're gonna do this morning, you guys, is this first session before our break. We are going to talk about Philippians. Okay, we're gonna talk about Philippi just because we're in the second journey now. But we're going to look at the book of Philippians. Even though Philippians is probably written later, it's probably written more back here, but just it has relevance to where we are in Paul's life, and so we're going to look at that, okay? And then after the break, then we're going to look at the next place Paul goes after Philippi is Thessalonica, right? And then so we're going to look at 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So that's the plan for today, and yeah, I believe that God has some good stuff for us, some challenging stuff for us this morning. What I want us to just think about first, okay, as we start, is when Paul writes, he always has a purpose, okay? And what I want to sort of begin with is I want you to realize that every book you study of Paul has a particular background. It has something he's trying to get across to people, okay? I remember when I did my SBS, it was actually a revelation for me, and I know you guys are probably much better about this than I was. I never realized that Ephesians was written to a group of people in a place called Ephesus. Like, that was new to me. Like, I just thought that was a good Bible name, Ephesians, you know, something like that. Same thing with Philippians, those kind of things. And then actually realizing that, no, there was a particular group of people that Paul was writing to. And so to really get the heart, if you really want to catch what Paul is saying, you need, the more, I can say it this way, the more you understand what those people were going through, the more it's going to mean to you, right? The more it's going to impact you. And so that's why we do the work of looking at background, because the more you really identify with those guys, the more it's going to mean to you, okay? So that's why we do the work of kind of looking at background. All right, so when we look at Philippians, okay, or as we go into the second journey, where we were yesterday, we left off after Paul's first missionary journey. He goes, hears about the Galatians, and he writes the letter, right? And then after Paul's first missionary journey, what happens in the book of Acts that's a pretty significant event after Paul's first missionary journey? I'm hearing it. Say it nice and confident. The Jerusalem Council, right? Chapter 15. Did you guys talk about that much last week? Yes. You did? Tell me a little bit about the Jerusalem Council. What was the significant? It was in Jerusalem and it was a council. Okay, good. All right. Okay, so we got that. All right. So beyond that, let's just go for some extra credit now. How about that? Okay, so let's go for some extra credit. Beyond the fact that it was a council that took place in Jerusalem, what else can you tell me? Yeah.
It was discussing whether to include the Gentiles.
Okay, discussing whether to include the Gentiles. All right, good. And specifically, what do we, when we say include the Gentiles, what do we mean? Okay, good. Do they need to follow the law and be circumcised, right? Okay. And again, I was about to wait for translation. I don't need to do that. So, yeah, the idea was, do I have to become, basically, was Christianity going to be a Jewish religion? Or was it a religion for all people? That was the question in Jerusalem. Do I have to become Jewish to become a Christian? And in Acts chapter 15, they made this massive, and again, for us, we take it for granted. Of course, we know this, right? You guys, this was huge for these guys. Can you imagine? They were dealing with 1,800 years, 1,800 years of history. That this had been the tradition for 1,800 years. So think about your grandpa's, right? Just going back as long as you can remember. 1,800 years of history. And in Jerusalem, in 49 AD, they decided, you know what? This is what it looks like to be a Christian. This was a massive, massive thing that happens in Acts 15. And it really was, I mean, obviously it was of the Lord, but it's what opened the door then for just the gospel to go out. That God receives Jewish Christians and God receives Gentile Christians. And as we'll see in Ephesians, that he has made one new man in place of the two. There no longer is Jew and Gentile, right? Galatians 3:28 tells us that. There's no longer Jew or Greek, right? We are one in Christ, okay? So that happens in Acts chapter 15, all right? And then just after Acts 15, after the Jerusalem Council, what happens?
Split.
What do you mean?
Paul and Barnabas.
Paul and Barnabas split, right? Okay, and this is this would have been again, if we were to take the time to meditate about that and think about that, Barnabas was the guy that came alongside Paul, championed Paul, believed in Paul. So this would have been a pretty massive thing in the life of Paul, right? That his kind of mentor, guy that championed him, they actually split because of John Mark. And again, we won't go into that, but just there was this disagreement. And then Paul decides he wants to go and visit all the churches on the first missionary journey, right? So that takes us in now to chapter 16. Now, in chapter 16, there is an interesting principle that takes place. One of the first things that happens in chapter 16 is that Paul finds a guy named Timothy, right? Okay. And then what is one of the first things he does with Timothy? He has him get circumcised. Now, if you were Timothy, do you think, would you be reminding Paul about, hey, chapter 15, Jerusalem Council, right? I mean, we just make this massive decision, you don't need to be circumcised. And yet Timothy, as an adult, is going to get circumcised. Yes. All right. So, what's going on there, guys? Why? Didn't we just decide in chapter 15 we don't need to get circumcised? Now in chapter 16, he does. Yeah.
He explained it that because then it would be easier for them to reach the people in Philippi.
Okay.
Because they knew that he was a weak
Right.
man.
Good.
So not to provoke them, they did this.
Okay, good. Yeah, this is a passage that, unfortunately, because of the content, I think if you ever wanted to teach on commitment to the gospel, this would be the passage to do it. Unfortunately, it deals with circumcision, so it's a little bit awkward to talk about, right? But really, if you wanted to talk about commitment to missions, and again, you can't really probably make some big call to missions with this passage, right? But really, if you think about it, yeah, the whole reason exactly is Paul, this I will become all things to all people. It was for the sake of the gospel. Timothy, they will listen to you more if you will get circumcised. And Timothy does it, right? And so really, if you want an example of commitment to the gospel and commitment to missions, it's right here at the beginning of chapter 16. Again, I'm not saying, hey, let's start using this but I wish we could more, because really this to me is an example of someone saying, I will do it for the sake of the gospel, right? Yeah.
Who would listen to them more? People in Philippi.
Well, Jews. It's not just people in Philippi. It's the mission that they're going to have. Because, again, they're going to, in chapter 17, it says, as was Paul's custom, they go into the synagogue, right? So, Paul's still going to be going to the synagogue, still want to reach his people. There is a question, some you may have asked, well, how would they know if he's circumcised or not, right? That's always the question that people are like, right. That's always that sort of like awkward question. So how would they know this? Probably because the bathhouses, the places where they would, those things, they were naked in those places. And so it would be easy for the word to spread. Yes, they were. No, they weren't. That kind of thing. So, all right. So that's chapter 16. Okay, at the beginning of 16, and then we get into Paul moves now into Philippi, okay?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it because he was half Jew that he got circumcised? The Jews will listen to him more?
Yeah, it's because his father was a Greek, it says, right? And so he wasn't. And so just for the sake of this Jewish audience, Paul has him get circumcised.
So he was half Gentile, half Jew.
Right, yeah.
If he was a total Gentile, then if he's a complete Gentile, would he be circumcised and people
Well,
listen?
even for him to be circumcised is what they would call the God-fearers, right? Those were some of the proselytes. And so he's just taking this step of sort of, again, cultural submission, in a sense. He's kind of submitting himself to this culture in a way that would allow them to receive from him more.
Well, what about the Gentiles? The Gentiles don't need to do it. If he did it, then the Gentiles would feel obligated in doing it?
So why doesn't Paul have everybody like Titus? Is that what we're saying? Like, why doesn't he have other people circumcised? Or?
I'm thinking of the Gentiles because he was also half Gentile.
Right.
And if he did it, other Gentiles will feel pressure to do it.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was just simply because Timothy was going to be accompanying him into the synagogues, maybe for the position that Timothy had. I think he was just thinking, they will listen to you more. Okay, these people will receive from you more if you do this. It's obviously not something he requires of everybody, because we already saw Titus, right, in Galatians 2. Even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised. So it's not something he asks of everybody, but he does ask it of Timothy. So that's a good question, though. It's good. All right, so chapter 16, we get now into Philippi, okay? And you guys have read Acts now. And what I want to do is, I want to begin. I'm wondering, okay, can we just get up for a second? I want us to do a little something, okay? I want you to find people from your people, okay? So, if we can, like, I know we have several Koreans. If we get all the Koreans into one group, okay? If you've got maybe Europeans, if we could get you guys into one, just sort of get people that have. Asians, if we want to get Asians in one group, that's fine. Maybe if there's enough Koreans, you guys can get in your own group. All right, so we have Koreans, non-Korean Asians. Is that what we have? Just culturally kind of the same group, okay? All right. Okay, here we go. Now, ready? What I want you to discuss in your group, okay, is what is the thing that your people, okay, or your cultural group is the proudest of, all right? Or what is the thing? Wait, hold on. Hold on. What I'm saying is, okay, is what is the thing that makes your people who they are, okay? And another way you can think about that is if this was taken away from your culture, you just would no longer be your culture. If this was taken away from your culture, okay? So let me give a couple of examples, all right? I've asked this question other places, and I asked this to some Mongolians, okay? Does anyone have an idea what they said? I asked this to a group of Mongols. One of the things that they said was meat. Okay, because in their culture, okay, meat is incredibly important. If you took that away, if they were vegetarians, they would just no longer feel like Mongolians, okay? I've asked this of lots of different groups, and I don't want to give too many answers. I want you to tell me what you think. But just, do you understand the question? If this was taken from your culture, you would no longer feel like you are who you are, okay? Everybody got that? All right, so go ahead and just discuss that, and then we'll share.
it's like they all the same. I feel like you guys can join us. I think so. Because there's so much like cultural similarities.
All right, everybody got something? Y'all have something? Okay, let me just hear real quickly, guys. Because we got a lot to do today, but just let me hear real quickly from your groups. Who are you, and what would be a thing or a couple of things? Take this away, and we are no longer who we are. Okay, so who wants to start?
Yeah, I'll start.
Probably.
I'm from Colorado, and we're all about two things: mountains and marijuana.
All right, so take away mountains, and you would no longer feel like you're a Coloradoan. Okay, and possibly marijuana. Okay, all right. All right, someone else, another group. Yeah.
So we're Midwesterners here, and taking away the right to bear arms would be very
Okay, everybody understand that? The right to bear arms, like weapons, like to actually have weapons. Okay, good. Agriculture. All right, farming. Right? If they were no longer farmers, they would not feel like they were Midwesterners. Okay, good. How about back here?
We're from Northeast, East Coast.
East Coast.
And our status is our identity is wrapped up in our status, like our education, our jobs.
Okay, good. Really good. All right. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, and the nature and also the welfare system.
Oh, okay. All right, good. Okay, good. How about next group? Who we?
Sunchi, which is a Korean term of like reading between the lines.
The wisdom of sixth sense.
Wow. All right. Okay. And kimchi. All right. Yeah. I was wondering if that would come up, so that's good. All right. Good. How about this group here?
We have China, Taiwan, and Burma.
Okay. All right.
History for China, Taiwan, language, and Burma, the identity as a Buddhist.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. Yep.
We're Californian, we're the best. And if you take away the beach, and if you take away Mexicans. Our culture and our economy collapses.
Okay. All right.
This is we were the Washingtonians.
Okay.
And if you took away the outdoors, that would be something. If you take away something physical, if you removed coffee from the culture, everybody would throw a fit.
Coffee. Okay. All right. Good. Okay, you guys. Great. Let's go back to our seats. Oh, wait, I'm sorry.
You missed the two floaters back.
Oh, sorry.
Because we opposite ends of Canada. So he said healthcare,
Okay.
and I'm native, so I said land, language, and family.
Land, language, and family. Okay, good. All right.
It's so diverse. And then like,
Okay, we all have something that kind of makes us who we are, right? Every culture identifies with something, right? That is who we are. As I've asked this in Taiwan, before, family. That was one of the things that we talked about is if you take away the family structure, how central family is to that culture, right? And so I've heard Americans before say freedom. You take away freedom, and I will no longer feel like an American, right? That's what we hold on to, that kind of thing. And so for different cultures, it's different, right? But the reason I ask us that question is because the Philippians had a very strong identity, okay? They held on to something quite strongly. And Paul's going to write directly into that. He's going to be writing straight into that and talking to these guys, okay? So what was that identity? What was the thing that was important to the Philippians, all right? I want to just give us some background. Here, I actually have things up on a PowerPoint. So here we go. So here's some background for these guys. This is technically the first Christian church on European soil, right? We've kind of now moved on the second journey. We're sort of moving now from Asia into Europe, okay? A lot of the names that are used in the letter to the Philippians, Epaphroditus, Euodias, Syntyche, Clement, these are all Greek names. And so the church of Philippi is made up mostly of Greeks, right? One thing you may have noticed about Acts chapter 16 is that Paul normally goes into the synagogue, right? In Acts chapter 16, when he goes to Philippi, where does he go? The river. He goes to what they call a place of prayer. And it is supposed that means there was a rule at that time that if there were 10 Jewish heads of households, if there were 10 Jewish men with families, they had to build a synagogue. They were responsible to build a synagogue. So the fact that there wasn't a synagogue in Philippi, or at least doesn't look like there was, means that there may have not even been 10 Jewish heads of households, or at least faithful Jewish heads of households. There was no synagogue there. So it's a primarily Greek church. Acts chapter 16 mentions, just in that chapter, Luke records Lydia. He records a jailer and a slave girl. And so we have all three classes. We have upper class, middle class, and lower class. They're all represented in Acts chapter 16. So it's there's a diverse group that's there as far as status goes. All right. Women played an important role in the church in Philippi. And there was a disagreement between two women that's big enough that Paul actually calls them out by name, right, in Philippians. And this is what I want us to kind of look at particularly is 127. So just, we're going to look at Acts 16 and Philippians. So look at Philippians 1:27. Paul is going to use, again, Paul never wastes words. And he uses a very particular term here. And we're going to see that Paul is directly playing off of what was important to them. In 127, I think your Bible, I looked at it this morning, I think your Bible says, conduct yourselves as citizens or something like that, right? What is the word that it uses? How does it, can someone just read 127?
Above all, you must live as citizens of heaven, conducting yourselves in a manner worthy of the good news about Christ.
Okay, good. So above all, he says, conduct yourselves as citizens of heaven. He uses this word citizen here, right? And then look at chapter 3, verse 20. And if someone could just read that out loud.
But we are citizens of heaven where the Lord Jesus Christ lives, and we are eagerly waiting for him to return as our Savior.
Okay, good. So keep those two verses in mind, okay? Above all, live as citizens, right? Conduct yourselves as citizens of heaven, right? And then also in chapter 3, we are citizens of heaven. Now, go back to Acts chapter 16. And when Paul is in Philippi, there is this story of the slave girl, and he casts this demon out of the slave girl. And the owners, verse 19, we'll start at verse 19 of chapter 16. Okay, so Acts chapter 16, verse 19. When her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas, dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. When they had brought them to the magistrates, verse 20, they said, "These men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city." Okay, so again, Jews were a minority here. Verse 21, this is the one I want us to pay attention to. "They advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice." Now, look at verse 12 of chapter 16. In verse 12 it says that they went to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. All right, so what's important to understand about Philippi is that it was sort of the leading city of that area. Okay, so it was we want to call it the New York of the United States, or the Los Angeles of the United States. It was the Seoul of South Korea. Okay, it was the Taipei of Taiwan. It was whatever. It was the leading city. That's where everybody kind of wanted to be from. And more importantly, it was a Roman colony, which means that there were Roman citizens. And notice that these people here, even though they are living outside of Rome, in verse 21, they advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice. So their identity, okay, even though they are living in Macedonia, even though they're living outside of Rome, is that we are Romans. We are Roman citizens. This is who we are. And that was the place of privilege and status. Okay? There are two sort of words that are going to be significant in this book. Well, they're not in the book, but these are two concepts that are going to be significant. Is the idea of status and privilege. If you were from Philippi, you were a Roman citizen. And that brought some very important benefits. Okay, here's some benefits of being a Roman citizen. Okay, if you were a Roman citizen, you had the right to buy property. You could be a landowner if you were a Roman citizen. You had the right to vote. They could elect officials. They had the right to appeal first to the people and then to the emperor. So that's why Paul, as a Roman citizen, some of his companions could not have appealed to Caesar. But Paul could, because he was a Roman citizen. So if you remember in Acts chapter, 23, I think it is, right? Or 24, I appeal to Caesar, right? They could not be executed without a trial, and they were exempt from certain punishments, including crucifixion. Okay, so this is why church history tells us that Peter was crucified, but Paul was beheaded, right? He could not be crucified because he was a Roman citizen. So that's why Paul was beheaded, all right? And they had the right to contract a legal marriage. So, to be a Philippian, if you were a Philippian, these were probably people that were very proud of the fact that they were Roman citizens. We are kind of better than everybody else. And you see that playing out then in this letter, all right? So again, that's just, very quickly guys, we could spend more time, but just so that you get this idea that Paul is going to be calling these people to live a certain way because they based all of their identity on their status and their privilege, all right? So why did Paul write this book? Paul writes it, first of all, Epaphroditus, who is one of theirs, he wants to tell them about his health, let them know that he's okay. The Philippians had given some gifts to Paul, so he wants to thank them for that. They are going through some sort of persecution, and so he's going to exhort them to joy in the midst of that about 14 times. Right? And then also, he is addressing division in the church. There seems to be this division that is cropping up within the church. And let's just read in Philippians a couple of passages together, just so that you see that. Chapter 1, verse 27. Paul says, let your manner of life, or yours says, conduct yourselves as citizens, right? Let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, not frightened at anything. So he says, I want to hear that you're standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side. So Paul is calling them to unity. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 2. So if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy. Verse 2, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. So here Paul says it again. You guys, he's calling them to unity. There is some sort of division that's taking place in this church. And then again in chapter 4, verse 2. It looks like it's Euodia and Syntyche, these two people, these two women are significant. Maybe they're leaders in the church, but their disagreement is significant enough that Paul has to actually by name call them out and say, I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord. There is division in this church. And so why is that, right? What's going on? I want to suggest to you guys, okay, my thought on Philippians is that because these people, if we have status and we have privilege, what does that create in us normally? Pride. Okay? That's what it creates. And we see that in chapter 16 of Acts, right? These guys are advocating customs not lawful for us as Romans to practice. And so these people were very proud of the fact that they were from a leading city, Roman citizens, and so it is causing, this pride is causing division. And so Paul is going to write this book of Philippians to deal with this situation, okay? All right, so how does he deal with the division? There is an interchange structure in this book, okay, that we're going to go back and forth in this. And basically what Paul is going to do is he's going to give an example from either his own life or someone else, and then exhort them, call them to something. Give an example, exhort them or call them to something. Give an example, exhort them or call them to something. Okay? Yeah.
The division is in the church, right? Not between them and someone else.
It's within the church. Yeah, I think it's because again, he keeps in 127 and 2:1-2, he's like, I want to hear that you guys, the church, one mind, one heart, striving side by side.
And then why did their pride, it was pride that they were better than other people in the church?
I think there was a pride that was it was culturally embedded in them, right? Because they had grown up with, hey, we're people of privilege. And when you're a person of privilege, the tendency is to not want to serve, right? That's the tendency. So
they had pride against themselves, not trials or.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, there could be that racial sort of thing, but I think it's basically two people who both have sort of grown up thinking, I'm awesome, are not normally going to be, hey, let me serve you in that. That's just not going to be natural for them, right? Okay? So Paul is going to go back and forth, and he's going to give example, exhortation, example, exhortation, example, exhortation, right? And that's going to be sort of the structure of this book. And the beginning, okay, if we look at verses 12 to 18, why don't you just, with the person next to you, read chapter 1, just as an example. Read chapter 1, verses 12 to 18, okay, with the person next to you.
The message of Christ
All right, so again, people who have status in their culture, okay, they were better than everybody else, the surrounding cities that weren't Roman colonies, other people in Macedonia. You guys aren't Roman colony, but we are. We have status. There is privilege that's attached to that. So here's a group of people in Philippi that have status and privilege, okay? Now, I think that most of us can or should relate to that. The reality is, you guys, if you are doing a DBS in Kona, the reality is most of you come from a place of status and privilege. That's just reality, okay? If we are here, most of us are coming from, some of us just culturally, our culture right now, our country right now is you want to call it a first world or whatever terminology you want to use. Many of us come from that kind of a culture. We come from a place of status and privilege. We're just born into it. We had nothing to do about it. It was just where we were born, okay? Most of us in this room come from that kind of place. And even if you don't come from a culture or a country that's normally associated with that, for you to be here means you probably are coming from some sort of place that has more privilege than most everyone else from where you're from, okay? So I think most of us should be able to relate to this, all right? I'm not trying to be awkward, but just that's the reality. If we're here, you guys, we are coming from a place of privilege, okay? So we have much, I think, to learn from what Paul says to the Philippians, okay? And what Paul is going to do is he's going to say, okay, to a people that are born with status and privilege, and again, Paul was one of them, wasn't he? Paul himself was a Roman citizen, so he's not going to be saying anything to these guys that he cannot relate to himself, okay? And what he's going to call them to is joy, all right? But what joy is, where does joy come from? What Paul is going to show is that joy is, it's a sequence, it's an order, that we get our priorities straight, okay? And joy comes from putting Jesus first, others second, and yourself last. That's where joy comes from. And that's what Paul's going to show us in this book. That if we want to walk in true joy, and I will use the word humility here in a little bit, if we're going to walk in that, it comes simply from getting our priorities straight. And I believe what was causing division in Philippi, what was going on there, was that you had people that were like the disciples there in John chapter 13. I'm not going to wash your feet. No. That's someone else's job. And so Jesus has to basically come and wash the disciples' feet, right? It's putting Jesus first, others second, and ourselves last. And Paul's going to give example after example after example of what that looks like, okay? And what I think the beautiful, wonderful, gives me goosebumps message in this book is that we have that DNA in us if we are Christians. It is part of your inheritance. Now, we also have the flesh, which is part of our inheritance from Adam. Okay, we also have that. But if we are born again, there is something planted in you that resonates with this, and it says, yes. There is something in you. We're going to see that. In chapter 2, Paul says, have this attitude amongst yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus. It's yours. You have this in you if you are a Christian, if we're born again, okay? And then we're going to see that as we go through this. So let me just give an example. So we just read 12 to 18. Paul gives the first example of himself. And I want you to... Oh, sorry. This is just something I think this is our culture, right? We live, I think the spirit of our age, and certainly the spirit of the internet, and all the things that I read on Facebook, okay, is I just have people posting these kind of things all the time. Everyone right? Well, I like that. Yeah, these are the kind of things you like. You deserve to be happy. Don't let everyone forget. Don't let anyone make you forget that. Right? I mean, And then I saw this one. You deserve to be happier than you are. Right? So it's like not only do you deserve to be happy, but you deserve to be happier than you are. Right? I mean, of course, everyone's going to agree with that. Yeah. Oh, that's so awesome. Right? And then I had a friend post this. You deserve to be with someone who makes you happy. Someone who doesn't complicate your life, someone who won't hurt you. Now, of course, all of us are going to agree to that, right? We're going to hit that on our Facebook as well, because it's like, yeah, that's true. You deserve to be happy. And we just live in a culture, most of us have come from a culture that says you deserve to be happy. And what that is, you guys, is who goes first in that. And especially, if I deserve to be with someone who makes me happy, well then what have I just done? I've just put myself up here, and whoever this person I'm going to be married to, or my partner or whatever, down here. Because you know what? You exist to make me happy. And you guys, let me just say right here, this is a recipe number 1 for a terrible marriage right there. Okay, if you want a really bad one, go into it with that philosophy. I deserve to be with someone who makes me happy. You're not making me happy, so what's your problem? Right? I mean, that's kind of what we do. But that's just that if we're not careful, it's just the culture that we've grown up in. And we hear it in music, we hear it in the movies that we watch, we hear it everywhere around us, is that this is what we deserve. And so Paul gives his own example, and in verses 12 to 18, I want you just to see that what Paul puts first, okay, when he talks about what has happened. Verse 12. Okay, look at verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. And what he talks about is that he says, you know what's important to Paul is the gospel. It's Jesus. That you know what, yes, I'm in prison, but that's okay. Because it's advancing the gospel. Verse 14, because of what's happening to Paul. And trust me, prison for Paul was not awesome, okay? But what was happening to him, other people are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Verse 15, people preach Christ. Verse 18, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. That Paul could be happy, he could have joy because Christ is proclaimed. And in that I rejoice. And we talked about it this morning in worship, right? At least the part that I was here for at the end, where Paul was so consumed with Jesus, that Jesus was so big in his life, that it was like, man, it's all good because Christ is proclaimed. And for Paul, what he wanted the Philippians to catch with these people of privilege, these people of status, was that the gospel comes first. And that's what they needed to hear. And then if you go on in chapter 1, this famous passage again, let's just real quickly, let's read verses 19 to 26. Okay, read 19 to 26, just with the person next to you. Chapter 1, verses 19 to 26. All right, so here Paul is talking about his own internal struggle, right? He's being very honest with these guys, and he's saying, you know what? I would love to just be out of here. I'd love to just be able to go and be with Jesus, right? But, verse 22, he says, if I live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. My desires depart and be with Christ, for that's far better, right? Here's a guy that just is in love with Christ. But, verse 24, to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know I'll remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith. So Paul says, you know what I'd like to do? He said, I'd like to be out of here. I'd like to depart and be with Christ, and that's much better. But It's more important for your sake that I stay. So what does Paul do in his own example? He says, I'm going to put you guys above myself, and I'm going to stick around, right? So he gives his own example here of this is how I live. And then he calls them then, verse 27. Because of that, then he says, now I want you guys to live this kind of life together. Again, notice we already read it, verse 27. Stand firm in one spirit with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. So you guys be unified, be together for what? For what? What does it say? What does your Bible say in 27? Does it say for the sake of the gospel or? Okay, for the faith, which is the good news. Okay, this is the good news. So Paul says for the sake of the gospel, right? Putting Jesus first, you guys. You guys just need to do this. And then in chapter 2, okay? In chapter 2, then he gives the example of Christ now, right? Okay, so then he's going to call them to this exhortation. And then chapter 2, he gives the example of Christ. And again, Paul is saying, I want you guys to live this kind of life. I want you to live an others-focused life. And we're probably thinking to ourselves, yeah, that sounds great, Paul, but how? How do I do that, right? And so Paul says in verse 5, he says, I want you guys to just go ahead and read verses 5 to 11, okay? Chapter 2, verses 5 to 11.
You must have the same attitude that Christ
Okay, if you look at this again, this idea of status and privilege, if you look at verse 6, what Paul gives is he says, okay, if anyone had status and privilege, it was Christ, right? He says, verse 5, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ, who though he was in the form of God, okay, this was his status, he was God, right? He did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. He didn't hold on to that privilege. But what did he do? It says he made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant. Now, how did Jesus make himself nothing? Did he become less God? No, that is a heresy. Okay, he did not become less God. He became more servant. That's what humility is. Okay? Jesus did not become nothing or make himself nothing by becoming less God. That is a heresy. Jesus became nothing by making himself more of a servant. And if you look at verse 8, it says, being found in human form, he humbled himself. How? By becoming obedient to the point of death. The simple, most just purest definition of humility is just obedience to Christ. That's a humble person. It's not someone who kind of goes, hey, you did a good job singing this morning. Oh, no, I didn't. My voice is terrible. That's not humility, you guys. That's false humility. Humility, it says, he humbled himself how? By becoming obedient to the point of death. That is humility. If you want to be more humble, become more obedient to Christ. That's the simple mark of humility here, right? How did he make himself nothing? It was not by becoming less God. That is false humility. It was by becoming more servant, which is true humility. His obedience. Okay, and this is where it starts to just get amazing to me here, because we're starting to look at the Trinity, okay? Jesus' obedience was to the Father. Okay? Notice it says, verse 8, being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. He was obedient to whom? The Father, right? He was obedient to the Father. That's what Jesus did when he was on earth. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death. His obedience was to the Father. He put God the Father first. So again, even Jesus lives an others-centered life. He puts the Father first. Remember what he prays in the garden. Father, if it be your will, what? Let this cup pass from me. But not my will, but yours be done. Right? That's Philippians 2:8. He humbled himself by becoming obedient even to the point of death, even death on a cross. Right? And so Jesus, when he was on the cross, what he did here was it was putting God the Father first. And this is one of those moments where I don't want to just be the Bible teacher that dumps on worship songs, okay? But I am going to dump on one right now, okay? So, I say this simply because we need to be careful. When we live in a culture, okay, and everything around us that, you deserve to be happy, you deserve to be happier than you are, you deserve to be with someone who makes you happy, we will bring that right into our relationship with God. You guys, without even thinking about it. Because why do we normally get upset with God is when what? He's not making us happy, right? I mean, that's normally when we get upset, right? And this song that we sing, and again, forgive me, but I think I need to make this point. Is you guys know that song, Above All? Above all powers, above all something or other, that's not right. The last line of that song says, you took the fall and what? Thought of me above all. No, he didn't. I don't think that's actually biblical, you guys. I think what's biblical is that he thought of the Father above all. That what he did was that he put the Father first. He became obedient to the Father. And again, I understand the concept of that song, and that it really does make us feel good that, he thought of me above all. But really, what Philippians 2 says is that Jesus thought of the Father, and he put the Father first. And it was not my will, but your will be done. That's what he did. And so he puts the Father first, and he becomes obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. But then, you guys, verses 9 to 11, the absolute just wonder of the Trinity, the beauty of the fact that we as Christians worship a triune God, the importance of this is that God has always been relationship, right? He's always existed in relationship. And notice, when Jesus says, not my will, but yours be done, he becomes obedient to the point of death. Jesus does that for the Father. And then, so what does the Father turn around and do? What does verse 9 say? Therefore, what? God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. So here Jesus says, okay, Father, I'm not my will but yours. I'm going to submit myself to you. I'm going to be obedient to you. And then the Father says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give you the name that's above every name. That's what the Father does for the Son. And so notice that in the very essence of the Trinity, the essence of this God that we love and serve is others-focused. That's the nature of the Trinity. And of course, not even to speak of the Spirit, who's not even mentioned here, but that's all that the Spirit does, is just glorifies Christ. 1 Corinthians 12 says we can't even say Jesus is Lord except by the Spirit of God. That's what the Spirit does. That the Trinity, you guys, this God that we worship in the very essence of the Trinity is putting others first. The Son becomes obedient to the Father. The Father says, I'm going to exalt the Son. And the Spirit just says, I'm happy just to exalt everybody. That's what the Spirit does, right? That's who God is. It's the God that we serve. And the importance of that is in verse 5. Have this mind, which is yours in Christ. See, if you have been born again, you have this DNA. This is the nature of who God is. And so His nature being born into us says that, you know what, this does not come natural to us. It comes supernatural to us. Does that make sense? Do you guys understand that? That's who we have. It's your inheritance in God. And so for these Philippians, Paul is not saying, hey, Philippians, become less Philippian. No. Become less Roman citizen. No, he's saying become more servant. This is the model. How does an upper class business owner like Lydia serve someone like a ex-military jailer there in chapter 16? If they're both in the same church, right? If Lydia and the jailer now are in the same church, how do they work together? How do they serve each other? How do different cultures come together? How does that happen? It happens in the gospel. Because in everything we have the gospel, we have the good news of Christ humbling Himself, giving up status and privilege out of love and obedience to the Father. So this is, you guys, this is our spiritual DNA. This is given to us. It's the essence of who God is. All right, then if we go on, okay, in chapter 2, why don't you just read verses 19 to 30, okay? Just again, read those two examples with the person next to you, 19 to 30. All right, so what does Paul say? He talks about Timothy and Epaphroditus. And again, he has a reason for doing this. He's very intentional in mentioning these two people, all right? And notice what he says about Timothy. Verse 20, I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare, right? This is someone who puts others first. Verse 21, they all seek their own interests, not those of Christ. Right? So again, they seek their own interests, not those of Christ. Timothy is an example of someone who puts the gospel and others first. Then what does he say about Epaphroditus? Look what he says in verse 30. Verse 29. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. Epaphroditus, what do we see about him? It says that he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete your service. That Epaphroditus lives this way. So Timothy is an example. Epaphroditus is an example. Everyone else looks to their own interests, not to those of Christ. He put Paul ahead of himself. That's who Epaphroditus was. And then, chapter 3. We get the example of Paul himself, right? And we already looked at this passage yesterday. But now I think you understand why Paul says the things